welcome everybody to our Radical Talk session this afternoon focused on disability. My name's Kirsty Palmer. I am the Recruitment Project Manager at Radical Recruit. I joined the organisation a year ago now, just celebrated my anniversary. Previous to Radical, I spent 20 years working with blind and partially sighted people. I'm registered blind myself, so supporting my peers in the various capacities I worked in was really important to me. But when the opportunity came up to work at Radical, it was too tempting. And so I kind of had a personal battle with myself because I felt like working in the sight loss sector was a bit of a security blanket for me, because there would always be kind of experts on hand if anything went wrong with my technology or something like that. And then kind of jumping out of that world into a different world was massive. But yes, it's worked so far. So I'm really excited to be here today. As a reasonable adjustment, because I can't see you, I'm going to turn my camera off. But you've got Jim and Emma in the room who are much better looking than me. So I'll just turn my camera off and we'll do some introductions. But first of all, I just want to run through some little bits of housekeeping today. So the session is being recorded and we will share the recording after. So please look out for that. We invite you to ask questions at the end, but do feel free to pop them in the chat as you think of them, and we'll focus on those questions at the end. Today, the focus is on supporting employers. So if you have joined as a person with a disability looking for some support today, please do contact us at hello@radicalrecruit.co.uk and we'll be in touch and do our best to help you. And just to say that if there is any kind of abusive behaviour or language today, this is a positive conversation, so you will be asked to leave the call if you start using any abusive or negative language. All right, so that's the housekeeping out of the way. So it's Disability Pride Month, and it's a real opportunity for us to raise awareness and have positive conversations about disability in the workplace. And today, the session focus is on helping employers to understand their responsibilities under the Equalities Act, learn about the Access to Work scheme, and how you as employers can support colleagues through that process. So I'm delighted to welcome our special guest today, Jim Benstead, who has a wealth of experience working with disabled people and navigating the often tricky access to work process. So I'm going to hand over to Jim to introduce himself.
Thank you, Kirsty, and thanks, Emma, too, for inviting me today. And yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. So yeah, I've worked in assistive technology for almost 20 years now, in a variety of roles. Worked with kind of non-profits, home users, delivering kind of one-to-one training in various kind of bits of software that was very kind of computer focused. Set up kind of branches of non-profits across the UK to deliver that. Went on to work for Access to Work as an assessor, and we'll get onto what that term means specifically kind of later on. after that have now do quite a lot of kind of corporate training for people that are in employment who've had the access to work assessment. On the back of that, I've started providing support for employers who have gone through the access to work assessment process with one of their employees and helping them get adjustments that are being recommended put in place. So yes, I was a access to work assessor for a number of years. I still do assessing, not for access to work. And yeah, my main focus is that employee support part, which I find is often the bit that's missing. But yes, if anyone has questions today about any of that, really happy to answer as we go along.
Brilliant, thanks James. And also on the panel is our founder Emma. So Emma, do you want to introduce yourself and your background?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name's Emma. I'm the founder of Radical Recruit. In terms of my background, I've been working with the underdogs of society for about 18 years now, which makes me feel really old actually. And I started my career as a disability support worker. Born with the gift of the gab, I kind of moved into leadership roles pretty quickly. And for many years, I was responsible for supporting disabled folk to plan their support requirements. And in Australia, we call anything people with disabilities do is kind of termed an activity of daily living. And my job for many years was to understand or help people understand what it is that they wanted to do in their lives and put the support in place that would enable them to do that. And on reflection, none of those activities of daily living ever included work. Employment never came into the conversation. It was almost like, you know, people with disabilities, it was just assumed that they either didn't want to work or they couldn't work. So today, Radical Recruit supports people with disabilities to find meaningful work with employers that are inclusive and which offer sort of career progression opportunities, because there's a massive gap in the in charity ecology, if you want to call it that. And there aren't very many businesses doing this work well. So that's what we aim to do, and that's my background.
Thanks, Em. So between July and September 2021, 53.5% of disabled people aged 16 to 64 years in the UK were employed, and that's compared with 81.6% of non-disabled people. So there's a massive gap there. And Radical, myself, are committed to kind of trying to support employers to do the right thing, because in my experience, most employers do want to do the right thing. But I think there is a definite lack of support for employers out there. So hopefully today's conversation will go some way to informing, educating and supporting you. I think, what are the barriers that disabled people tell us that they face? I think number one, it's having access to good careers advice. So when I was young, which I know is many moons ago, the careers advice I was given was to become an aromatherapist. And to be honest with you, I could think of nothing worse than being an aromatherapist. But actually sat there, I remember a conversation with my godmother and her saying to me, well, what is it you're going to do? And she made all these suggestions, and I just sat there thinking, well, I'm not going to be able to see that, and I'm not going to be able to drive, and I'm not going to be able to do all those things. So what am I going to be able to do? And you know, if you acquire a disability later in life, you know, if you've had a career as a bus driver, for example, and then all of a sudden you acquire a disability that means that you can't drive, you know, often people are faced with, I don't know what I can do. And I think that's a massive barrier. And then I think another barrier is around education of employers, and employers having that confidence to support people and have those conversations. So yeah, I for me, they're two really important barriers there. What do you think some of the barriers people face?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, isn't it? I think if you strip it all back, it comes down to equality of opportunity. That for me is the biggest challenge. I think people with disabilities don't enjoy the same access to opportunities, especially when it comes to employment, as non-disabled folk. So, I mean, there's loads of reasons for this. Societal views being the most obvious, I think. You know, disability is heavily stigmatized, and I think this is predominantly born out of, you know, a lack of awareness for disability in the workplace, which leads to stigma and misrepresentation. You know, our welfare systems discourage people from entering employment, and broadly speaking, there is insufficient disability support services and a complete and utter lack of like interagency working. Non-inclusive education, you kind of touched on this before, you know, a major factor also. Data tells us that because the education system isn't fit for purpose for all people with a disability, this leads to lower levels of education and training amongst the community. You know, I used to work as a teacher's assistant in a special developmental school, and I can say with steadfast conviction that there is a severe lack of structured support. So for younger people leaving school and making the transition into the workplace, there's really no support there, you know. In terms of like employers, I was reflecting on what I've observed and the conversations, you know, I've had with radical employers. I think the key barriers are just a lack of awareness and in particular confidence, you know. People and employers don't understand how to include people with disabilities. There's a real nervousness and a fear. You know, also misplaced fear is a real barrier of legal challenges, of insurance issues, and again, born out of just a lack of awareness and education. Accessibility barriers is a big issue, not just in the built environment or workplaces, but if you think about what you need to do to get to work, you've got to be able to get on a train and get off the platform. I mean, some of our train stations aren't accessible for people with disabilities. And I guess, you know, the reason we're here is inadequate provision of workplace adjustments. So that they're the things off the top of my head. I mean, I could go on for days.
Please
there's
don't.
Loads of challenges, but I shall stop now.
Thanks, Erin. Some really good insights there. And Jim, what would you say some of the barriers that disabled people face when trying to access work?
I mean, just to echo what Emma said there, that this is a very, very big subject and I speak about it for a long time. But to pick up what she said at the end, to give maybe a bit of a technocratic answer, that there are really three things with reasonable adjustments that I think become a problem. First of all is finding out, and this is for someone who might need the reasonable adjustment, what services are out there to do the assessing. So here we're talking about access to work. Some employers go with a private assessment process. Some employers are prevented from using access to work. Talk about that later. If you're a civil servant, you wouldn't be using access to work. So speaking very generally about assessment services, that's the first thing, find out about that. The second thing is, I guess, what we're talking about today, which is navigating through that access to work process. It's not perfect, but with some relatively simple advice, you can get the most out of it. But without that advice, things can be more complicated than they maybe need to be. So that's the second thing. And then the third barrier is once that assessment is done, whether it's by access to work or
sorry, gang.
In Yankee Stadium, touched to tears by the tribute, Gary makes his last public appearance.
I'm not sure what just happened. Apologies.
No problem at all. So the third thing, so an employee's found out about Access to Work or some other assessment service. They get through the assessment process all right, and they've got this great report that tells them what they need, and that lands on the desk of their employer. Then we're into another part of the process that can become a barrier, which is actually getting that stuff implemented properly. Now, if it's a physical disability and someone needs a height adjustable desk, relatively simple. If someone has a visual impairment and they need a screen reader, and that screen reader needs to be installed on their computer, and it needs to be made to work with all of the systems their employer is using, that's a much more complicated question, and that's not something that Access to Work are going to help with, and that becomes a barrier and something that the employer needs to resolve, and needs to resolve on an ongoing basis, because the software, like any other software, would need to be maintained. So those are the three things: finding out about Access to Work, some other employment assessment service, getting the most out of that process, but then getting everything implemented and then maintained afterwards.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jim. I think, once everything's implemented, it only takes the software update, and then the technology I use can go completely wrong. So keeping that maintained is really, really important. So Jim, why does it make good business sense to ensure disabled people within organisations get the support that they need?
I think there's two ways to look at this. Overall, employers obviously have obligations to provide adjustments for people with disabilities. So once we get to that point, you can either pay a certain amount of money, incur some sort of cost at the top to get it done properly, or have an ongoing cost, which can be relatively significant, of having someone who has a barrier placed in front of them that means they aren't able to do their job. So if you have someone, for example, who needs an adjustment to do their job and that adjustment hasn't been provided, you're still going to be paying them. If the adjustment isn't provided properly, then they might be able to do their job, but it's going to be incredibly kind of stressful and demoralizing for them, and you're not going to be getting the best out of them. So with things like that, I tend to step away from this idea of reasonable adjustments. Almost, you're just giving people the tools they need to do their job in the most efficient way, and that means you're getting the most out of their time. So yeah, that's really the kind of biggest part of it. But there's a general thing here as well. That if I'm working with employers who are trying to implement reasonable adjustments, those adjustments can often be of benefit to people in the organisation who they aren't immediately intended for. So if we've got really simple example, some spreadsheet that someone with a visual impairment needs to access, we might need to change that spreadsheet, change the colours on it, change the layout, just make it easier to access. But all of those changes make it easier for absolutely everyone in the organisation to access that. So you find often that accessibility adjustments are really just good design things that could have been done years ago without even specific reference to disability, and it would have been not difficult to do, and it would have benefited the organisation overall. So there's two things there. One is just that idea that not addressing these things proactively can lead to massive costs, whether they're like the direct cost of paying someone who's not working, or someone not being able to complete their job as well as they would be able to. But also this idea that it isn't just about supporting maybe one individual. These changes can have this knock-on effect for everyone in the organisation, so things run better.
Great, thanks, Jim. You spoke there about reasonable adjustment. So yeah. What is a reasonable adjustment, and what's reasonable for maybe a large employer or a small employer? Does that differ?
I'm not a lawyer. My understanding is that whenever you hear the term reasonable in law, it basically means that they're creating the space that it could be argued in the courts, and that's essentially the long stop on it. Now, in practice, an adjustment is just something that someone who has a disability needs in order to access some sort of service or to access employment. The reasonable part of it, in effect, comes down to the budget of an organisation. So if you are operating a shop with a small turnover, the reasonable adjustment that you might need to make is to provide some sort of ramp that would allow a wheelchair user to access the building. But you might be able to argue, look, there's other ways I can provide my service to people who need to access the building in that way. And my turnover, that's a big chunk of my turnover. And you could say, look, that's just not on the balance of things the right way to go. If you're a larger employer, let's say the NHS, reasonable adjustment can really be anything. Now, access to work will turn down certain things, but in my experience, when I was with them, they accept most things. So yeah, if the budget is there, an adjustment is going to be reasonable.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? What is reasonable? So tell me about the Access to Work scheme and who is eligible to apply.
Anybody who has a disability. So the application, while the employer will kind of be involved, we'll talk about that later, the application initially is undertaken by the employee, and it's anybody with a disability. Now, I'm going to look up strict definition of disability under the Act. Now, this is from a guide from the Government Equalities Office that I'll circulate later on in the chat. And it's saying that the general definition of disability for the purposes of the Act, which is the Equality Act, is a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on a person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Long-term in this context is defined as having lasted or being likely to last for at least 12 months or the rest of a person's life. Substantial is defined as more than minor or trivial. So there's still some sort of legalistic stuff in there, but anyone who had some sort of disability based on that definition would be eligible to apply for access to work.
And should somebody expect if they made an application? How does the process work?
Currently, I need to flag this up. There is a not insignificant wait time. So pre-COVID, you could expect to receive a one-to-one in-person assessment relatively quickly. If post-COVID, these assessments have gone to be over the phone. I haven't heard anything about them going back to be in person yet, but I'd be interested to hear from people who've had that experience. And the wait time is now around about 12 weeks. One thing I would say, I think you get prioritized if you're making that application within the first 6 weeks of being in a new role. And this is a key takeaway from today. If you can get that process started within the first 6 weeks of employment, things are going to work better for you. After an initial conversation with someone who'll check you're eligible, the process will, on the employee side, will move on to the assessment, which is essentially a chat with someone, now over the phone, used to be in person, where they will find out about your job. They'll find out about the barriers that you're facing doing your job, and then they'll make some recommendations for you for things that are hopefully going to remove those barriers. So if you have a vision impairment, for example, an assessor might be recommending a screen reader or screen magnification software as one adjustment. You then, a few weeks later, get a report sent back to you, and that's when you get onto the implementation stage, where the employer needs to step in and make sure this stuff is put in place. I should say as well, I've got the chat open here and there's some really interesting questions coming through. So Kirsty, do let me know if you'd like me to come back to those. I think they're kind of relevant for the conversation.
Do we want to address those now, Kirst?
Yeah, go for it.
Will you do the honours of reading and answering them, please, James?
Do you want me to do? Yeah, so
Yeah, they'll be for you.
Where are we? So the first one, so yeah, Lozzie, I've had difficulty getting adjustments I've requested because it's deemed as unfair to my colleagues. I've tried to explain that adjustments level the playing field for me, but it's seen as being given favourable treatment. How can I help change this narrative? This is a common and difficult thing. It has got better in my time of working with reasonable adjustments, but I think the first thing I'd like to say is it's not good enough, and I want to acknowledge that. And it needs to be done a lot better. And also, you're quite right. As we were saying before, you're being given the tools you need to do your job. You might need to be given specific tools to do your job, but that's just how it is. If you're being made to feel that you're somehow being given favourable treatment, I would first of all take that up internally with your employer. Now, I know that may not lead to getting it resolved, so I have a kind of external recommendation as well. But that's the first thing. If you feel you can raise that with your line manager or with HR, and potentially with the support of your union, and I appreciate that not all unions are supportive of people with disabilities all the time, then that can be a constructive way to get it resolved. If once you've exhausted that, you're still having problems, the go-to people, in my view, for any discrimination issue is the Equality Advisory and Support Service, who have a phone line that I've had a lot of benefit from supporting clients. If you Google EASS, they should come up as the first hit. You can click through to that and you can speak to them over the phone and they can advise further about what can be done there. But yeah, this is unfortunately common. And to go back to the point I was making before, that really this is about how organizations run as a whole, right? If people within an organization are responding like that to a reasonable adjustment, it suggests to me that there are other bigger issues the organisation should be resolving. So yeah, I hope that's helpful, Lozzie. If you want to come back in the chat, if you've got any more questions. Yeah, okay, so you're saying you're down to the grievance process. Okay, I'm glad you're in touch with the EAS and ACAS. Hopefully you get the support that you need. Again, I'm sorry you're in this position. Thank you for bringing it up. It's good to kind of raise it there. And
James, if I may, James,
yeah.
You know, we talked about the business case for, you know, doing this well and supporting people with disabilities. This is a really good example of why it's important.
Oh, absolutely. I have multiple clients at the moment who have gone through grievance processes that ultimately have had to have been resolved. The resolution of that grievance process has been what was suggested to the employer 18 months before. So not only have they had an employee who's been off work for 18 months on full pay, not only is that employee demoralized, not only have they had to bring in people from HR, line managers, all of this paid time that's being spent on it, the resolution that they've got at the end is exactly what was there at the start. So, and ultimately with this, the Equality Act, especially if EASS, and again, ACAS is another, definitely another good port of call with this, as soon as EASS and ACAS are involved, it's probably going to happen anyway. So employers can feel a lot better about themselves and get it done for their employees and have a more productive time as a business by being kind of proactive about it.
And the other thing, I guess, for businesses to consider is if you get to the end of that ACAS process or the grievance process, whatever it is, and the relationship between the business and the employee is broken, essentially. Often the employee doesn't come back, and you settle, on money, right? So there's another cost.
Yeah, and a lot of the times, I have one client that I'm working with at the moment. I believe their employer in many ways wanted to do the right thing. As you were saying at the start, most employers want to do that. Now, but even with that will, they've still ended up in a complex grievance process. And I've kind of watched this from the edges. And even once the grievance was raised, this gets sort of complicated, but structural elements of the way large organizations are run can work really badly with accessibility. And yeah, you just see it sort of playing out. So it's not a kind of like willful thing necessarily. Those things do happen. It can be a bunch of people who are very well intentioned within an organization, but the structure of organizations in general holds everything back. Yeah, just Elaine's point there about it's a tricky, the reasonable adjustments thing. If someone needs the adjustment, it should be irrelevant where they are working. Elaine, I mean, I'm kind of with you on that. I think employers should provide the adjustments that are needed. In most cases, they do. I'm not aware of any cases from when I was working at Access to Work where I recommended something and it was not back in that way. So you should feel reassured that whoever you're working for, you can get what you need. I think with any law that passes, it's a process of negotiation. So that term there, reasonable, is there to facilitate that. In practice, most employers are going to be, even relatively small ones, are going to be providing adjustments to people that need them. So please, don't be put off from working for a particular organisation because of that.
There is financial support for smaller organisations, isn't there? So, I mean, a big organisation would be expected to foot the bill and then recuperate those costs. But if you're a smaller organisation, like we are at Radical, Access to Work pay upfront.
Yeah, they do. I've got some stuff to circulate on this, but there's the cost share scheme. So again, reading from the UK government, such on that screen, when the cost sharing applies, Access to Work are going to refund up to 80% of the approved costs between some threshold and 10,000, and the employer contributes 100% of costs up to the threshold and 20% between the threshold and 10,000. So the threshold, if you've got 0 to 49 employees, is nothing. 50 to 249 employees is £500. Over 250 is £1,000. And then usually anything over 10,000, which is quite rare, is just met by Access to Work. So that funding is there again. I think I should stress as well, the reasonable and reasonable adjustment very usually doesn't come into play. If you are in work and you need an adjustment to do your job, you should assume that in the first instance that adjustment can be provided for you, because in almost all situations it can.
And James, what sort of equipment does Access to Work fund? What does it fund?
Pretty much anything. I was given, as an Access to Work assessor, kind of free rein, as long as I could justify it, right? And justification is a sort of key buzzword in Access to Work stuff, that anything that's being recommended, there's two things to take away here. One, it has to be the minimum adjustment that someone needs in order to do their job, in order to remove a barrier. So, and that's really a phrasing issue. And that gets onto how you go through your Access to Work process. So it's not, you're not looking for something that is really kind of fancy. It's just a minimum adjustment that's going to do it. Now, in practice, there are ways to move through that, because in my view, if you need an adjustment, you need an adjustment. And this minimum thing is bureaucracy. the other part of it is this really key thing, which is justification. So any access to work advisor, and so again, terminology, access to work assessor meets with the customer, i.e. the employee, does the assessment, works out what's needed. The advisor is back at the DWP and they're reviewing the report that comes back and processing it. The assessor has to justify every recommendation. The advisor is then checking for those justifications. So that's a key word. There is actually an internal access to work staff guide, which they keep online for some reason, which again, I can circulate in the chat later, that covers all of this. In practice, to give you some examples, if I'm assessing someone that has dyslexia, there's literacy support software, there's mind mapping software, but there's also coaching sessions I can recommend. If I'm assessing someone who has a visual impairment, then I might be recommending a screen reader or screen magnification software. So it's heavily software driven, but that's because a lot of jobs are heavily computer based. I did an assessment a few years ago for a visual artist who was working with stained glass, and she had a physical disability that meant she experienced kind of quite a lot of pain on a daily basis, and lifting stained glass is very, very difficult. So through talking to her, we figured out that the adjustment that was needed was like sort of counterweighted easel, and we were able to commission someone to build that, design it from scratch, and then deliver it to her, and that was what she needed, and that did the job. So there is a lot of room there. Access to that, they did stop me from recommending automatically opening doors after a while, because the cost of that automatically got up to kind of 15,000, and they would make the case that that was actually something that the employer was going to need to provide, because it was going to be a benefit to customers as well. So there are edge cases, but really it's anything you kind of need to do your job. What that is varies from person to person, and that's the point of the assessment, to figure that out.
And one of the things we talked about on our briefing call, James, was people who need what they call support workers or personal assistants. But that's another kind of assessment, isn't it? Tell us about that.
So there's two other parts of the process. One is kind of getting into work. So access to work can provide things like taxis if you're not able to drive or access public transport. That's not something that I was asked to do when I did assessments for access to work, but I could put a note in the report to say you need to have a conversation with your access to work advisor, i.e. the person at the end of the phone at the DWP, who will get that done for you. And then you can order up those taxis and reclaim the costs afterwards. There can be issues with reclaiming those costs where it can take a while. So there might need to be something in there just to manage the cash flow. And again, that's something where recently access to work need to sort of improve things a bit, because people are struggling a little. On the other side, there is support available through support workers. I think, Kirsty, you've got more experience of this than I have, because you've used a support worker through access to work. What was the process like of getting that set up?
It was fairly simple in terms of the application. So they send you what they call a support worker log, and it's kind of done in 3 parts. So you look at your job description and you look at the tasks that you can do independently, ad hoc tasks, and then tasks where you might need support. So in terms of the support I need, is if I'm going to external meetings, I wouldn't be able to find my way there independently, so I need a support worker to help me to get to external meetings and to help me with kind of networking and identifying people that I need to speak with. So I filled out this form, and from there they come back and approve the number of hours that they will fund a support worker for each week. And then it's kind of the more difficult bit is it's my responsibility then to go out to find a support worker, but there are a number of agencies out there who can help. And I've been really, really lucky. I've had some amazing support workers. I even had one chap who, I mean, he was brilliant, and it was his day off, and I had to go to a meeting, and the meeting so happened to be near where he lived, and he said, "Oh, you know, Kirsty, I don't mind. It's my day off, but I'll meet you at the station, and I will take you to, you know, the venue because it looks a bit tricky on the map." So I turned up at the station, and he was waiting there, and we literally walked across a zebra crossing, and we were at the venue. So he'd come all that way to walk me across the zebra crossing, bless him. He got the map wrong, but you know, work with some great support workers, and I think the trick is to kind of you know, work with somebody who meets your needs and you get on really, really well with. But on that, I mean, I have faced some kind of negative, as in, you know, it takes two people to do your job, and that's really not the case. It's that person enabling you to do your job. It's not them doing the job for you. So I think people have to look at that very, very differently. So moving on to in terms of employer responsibility throughout that access to work process, James, what's the responsibility on the employer?
When the process has started with the employee, the employer will be contacted so they can sign off to say that we're happy to, apart from any other funding that's coming from Access to Work, that they will pay their share. So that's the first thing, and that gets signed off, I think, before the assessment even takes place. And then once everything's done, and this is sort of the tricky bit, Access to Work then really places responsibility for implementing the adjustments onto the employer, and they, Access to Work, do not provide support that I'm aware of to get those things implemented. And that really comes back to what I was saying at the start. If the adjustment is an ergonomic chair and a height adjustable desk, it's not a problem, you can figure it out. If the adjustment is some more complicated software that needs to be integrated with the systems that the employer is using, that is much more complicated. And what I would say just in the first instance here is, if as an employer you find you need to get software implemented or get any of these adjustments done, your first port of call for support is going to be the people that sold it to you, because there is a process here where the report will come to you. At the end of the report, there are recommended suppliers, and then you can contact those suppliers and get the things implemented. You can go to any supplier you want, but usually, because Access to Work, they'll have negotiated a better price than you'll be able to find elsewhere. Once you've bought the software from those organizations, they're responsible for making sure it's working for you, and they can advise how to get that up and running. You may wish to be more kind of proactive than that, and it can be kind of more cost effective to consider it as a special project, but that's your starting point. That's where the support is. I should say as well, IT departments, if they don't know about software, they can be a little bit reticent to seek support in that way. So if you are here as maybe an HR person, you need to make sure that IT are going to do that, because left to their own devices, they may not do. They may just say, look, we don't know about this, so that's that. So yeah, that's that's the sort of shape of the responsibilities that are placed on the employer there. So yeah, and it can be quite complex.
So it's really, because I think sometimes it gets a bit confusing, but it's definitely the emphasis is on the employee to make that application and to start the ball rolling. It's the employee's responsibility at the beginning, and then the employer kind of coming in at the end and trying to implement that support. Have you got any examples of kind of best practice where an employer's done the right thing by one of their disabled employees, where they've done a really great job of getting it right?
Sure. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind was a client that I've worked with for 18 months now. And they're employing someone who has experienced sight loss, and she needs to use screen reading and magnification software in order to do her job. It's made more complicated because she needs to access some sort of custom software that her employer uses. So that needs to be configured to run with this software. So it was a pretty in-depth process. And I'd say that what they did really well was to step up right at the start of the process and just start asking questions and seeking clarifications on things. This can be a hugely complex process. One of the big issues is an ownership issue, especially within really large organizations, where nobody quite knows who should be doing this, and no one really feels empowered to do anything. So no one really wants to take responsibility for it because they think they'll get it wrong and that they'll get in trouble for that. But just reaching out to all of the sources of expertise that are out there, which initially can be people that have been asked to provide training in this software, companies that have sold the software to you. There is this like ecosystem of support that's there, and just approaching it in that way of saying, we've been asked to do this, we don't know what we're doing, can you help us, is always going to be a much better approach than the sort of caginess that can come from larger organizations. And that's absolutely not about the individuals in that organization. It's about how organizations tend to be structured. This is a new thing that just doesn't work within those structures particularly well. So yeah, being open to it. It's not employers' fault if they don't know about this. And unless you happen to be an employer that makes assistive software or is in the business of reasonable adjustments, you won't know about this. So get that knowledge.
And can access to work, so say if you have an employee and they acquire a disability, whilst they're in employment with you. I spoke earlier about a bus driver that might acquire a disability. Can access to work help with the retention of employees who may acquire a disability whilst they're employed?
Yes, that's just a simple one. Yeah, they absolutely can.
Ah, fabulous. Okay, so we've spoke about the benefits of access to work. They fund equipment, they fund support workers. We've spoken about the process. I think we've touched on it a little bit. Is the scheme perfect, Jim?
It's not, and there are some parts of it that I would say are far from perfect, but I need to say something really important at the top of this, which is please do not be put off from applying by any of these kind of imperfections that I'm describing here, because they can be navigated, and oftentimes they can be navigated very simply once you've got the right information. And this is something that I'm working with clients on a kind of weekly basis to do, and I'm able to do it because I've got a bunch of knowledge about it, but it's not particularly complex. It's just a bunch of stuff you need to know. So the kind of what you might think of as the flashpoints in the process, first of all, the assessment that is going to get done, unfortunately, Access to Work might send out an assessor who just doesn't do a particularly good job. And as far as I'm aware, Access to Work don't have a great auditing process to check that the reports are okay. So sometimes I'll be asked to work with a client, I will look at their report and I'll be able to tell, without knowing anything about them, just the things that are recommended in combination don't make any sense. We then will need to go back to Access to Work and get adjustments made. So an absolute classic thing, if someone has a visual impairment and I see voice recognition software on the report, then that's a real red flag, because in most cases, someone with visual impairment won't benefit from that in a massive way. There are exceptions, of course, but that's just one example there. So you need to make sure that the assessment is accurate. Now, like this is a bit of a circular question, right? Because if you're asking to be assessed and you don't know the answers to this, then yeah, you may have, how do you solve that problem? And again, what I would suggest, there are sources of expertise out there. Many of the companies that are kind of in this sector, they're profit-making companies, but they will be generous with their time if you speak to them over the phone. And what you might wish to do is, if you can find a company that is potentially going to be providing the sort of adjustments that you need, you can chat to them on the phone and say, look, got an Access to Work assessment coming up. What are the sort of things that you think I should be asking about? And you can make a note there, though. And for, say, again, I do a lot of work with blind and visually impaired people, so I'll keep coming back to that as an example. But say you spoke to a company about that was in that sector, they might be talking to you then about screen reading software, about screen magnification software. You can then bring that up in the assessment, as long as you're not kind of going in with a sort of wish list, which they specifically don't like, but you can ask questions about these things, and that will help you ensure that your Access to Work report is as accurate as possible. So that's one place where things fall down. Another place is there is just a long delay. At the moment, it takes about 12 weeks to get the assessment done. Some employers prefer to go down private assessing routes. Other times, if you can get the assessment initialized within like the first 6 weeks of employment, I think they jump you to the top of the queue. And then say you've got the accurate report through, the problem there is not, it is with Access to Work. In my view, Access to Work should provide support to employers to help them implement this stuff. There are reasons why they don't, I think, but that's where things can fall down again. And what we have here is really, it's a series of single points of failure. So everything needs to be got right. At the implementation stage, everything needs to be implemented, but then it needs to be maintained. If the software isn't maintained and it stops working in 6 months' time, well, that's as bad as not having a software in the first place a lot of the time. So yeah, those are the flashpoints, really. Make sure the assessment is accurate. Get in as early as you can, because there is a delay at the moment. And just really focus on that implementation. And again, support from there in the first instance comes from the people that have sold you the software. If they've sold it to you, it has to be fit for purpose. That becomes a complex issue, but they're probably your first port of call.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is it's not perfect, and sometimes it can be a bit of a bumpy road, but definitely worth doing it.
Absolutely. And just to address, Billy's asked a question in the chat, why would Access to Work be negative without a wish list? I would have thought that having your needs set out would be helpful. It absolutely is helpful. Just to define what I mean by wish list, if I go in to sort of do an assessment, and someone is able to really lay out what their needs are, then I'm in the best possible position I can be in order to start addressing those needs by recommending solutions. Similarly, one question I might ask is, have you had, like, so someone's in their 20s, they're in one of the first jobs and they've gone through disabled students allowance. What adjustments did they have through that were helpful? What have you used in the past? And again, if someone is a long-term JAWS user, if they're using that as a screen reader, we can recommend that again. So all of that is absolutely fine. The wish list thing is really about giving the Access to Work assessor room to do their job, because someone who Access to Work customer, an employee, might have, from research they've done on their own, a really clear idea about an adjustment that would be good for them. But it might be that because of the professional experience of the Access to Work assessor, while they'll take that on board, they know the reasons why there's something out there that in their view professionally is going to be a better adjustment, or there might be a kind of technical reason within the Access to Work system why that adjustment wouldn't work. So that's what wish lists are about. I guess it's about, you can't expect to turn up and say, these are the 10 things I want, and it will just get signed off, but that can certainly inform the assessing process. Sorry, Billy's second question, are assessments portable for similar roles? If you go into another role, you can take your, so if Access to Work have fully funded your adjustments, then your employer has to let you take those adjustments with you. Even if your employer has partially funded the adjustments, Access to Work sort of firmly request that you're allowed to take those adjustments with you, because the assumption is that they're so specialist, these adjustments, that there's going to be no one else in the organization using them. So that just kind of makes sense. At the same time, if you're going into a new role, you may wish to go through the Access to Work process again. And in a more general sense, if your condition has changed or if your role has changed, you might want to get another assessment. So it is an ongoing process. Also, there might just be new stuff out there, like the technology that's available through OrCam at the moment is really quite striking, and something that just wasn't around 20 years ago. So potentially having like an updated assessment every 3 years or whatever might be helpful too.
Do the assessments or the reviews happen automatically, or do you need to request those?
I'm not aware of any kind of automatic review of anything. But yes.
It feels like there's a lot of onus on the person with the disability to get it right the first time. And my feeling is that the squeaky wheel gets the most oil. Would that be a fair observation?
Partly. I mean, there's an issue that I see a lot, which is if an organization, by default, many organizations, if they're asked to provide adjustments for somebody, there will be no expertise in the organization about those adjustments. And we can't expect there to be, right? It's just life. Now, the onus then falls often on the employee to get stuff working. And often, like, I'm speaking to clients who have been told by their IT departments, oh, you need to go and speak to the supplier of this. Just to go back to this idea that I think it clarifies a lot of thinking, to say all we're doing here is providing people with the tools they need to do their job. Some people require specialist tools, but they're just the tools they need to do their job. If it was, I don't know, 40 years ago, there was a lot more kind of manufacturing in the UK than there is now. And we were working in a factory and the machine we were working on broke down. We'd think it was absurd if our employer came to us and said, oh, can you get this sorted? Can you phone the people that have made this, get them in and get it fixed? And that's really something to avoid, is this idea that the employee has really any responsibility for making sure this stuff is working properly. You might need to check in with them to make sure that it is, but the onus is on the employer there. In terms of, do you, if you're going through an access to work assessment, or if you're supporting someone going through an access to work assessment, I'd always advise them to ask questions, to ask if there are any further adjustments available, to say yes to anything that's offered, unless they're absolutely sure it's not going to help, because they're not committing to anything by doing that. And then they can review the report later, which will then be kind of more comprehensive. And again, there's no real commitment from the employer there either, because the refund process is all very, very straightforward. And just because something is on the report, it doesn't mean that the employer has to pay for everything kind of upfront, as it were. So yeah, I would suggest that employers say to employees that they go into this process feeling empowered to suggest, to speak about their needs and to get those needs met, rather than maybe being concerned about costs and all that stuff.
And can I ask one more question? If we know it takes 6 weeks from the job start date to get the assessment, and then further time to implement the recommendations, it kind of makes sense, at least to my way of thinking, to bite the bullet, invest in a private assessment, expedite the whole process, because in theory, whoever you've employed won't be able to actually do their job or some of their job during the period they're waiting for the adjustments. What does an assessment cost? Like what would that look like? Do you know?
Oh, that's a very good idea. Full disclosure, I do work for them. I do provide assessing services for them, but to get a sense of the costs of these things, there's an organisation called Posturite, who do a lot of assessing all sorts of things across the UK. They initially were an ergonomics company, and that's still their focus, but they do assessments for all sorts. I'm not sure what their actual costs are there, but it's certainly worth bearing in mind if you can do the back of an envelope calculation that says, if we've got this delay with access to work, we might prefer, and again, it can be 12 weeks before the assessment happens, and then everything after that, you might prefer to go through a kind of private assessment. Private assessments as well, the assessor can have a bit more wiggle room to recommend stuff that's going to be helpful, that may be access to work. They have some weird rules and regulations about kind of software subscriptions and things like that. You can get a better assessment that way. And yeah, it can be done a bit quicker. But yeah, I'd start with Posturite. Another organisation, again, one that I happen to work for, is Visualised Training and Consultancy. They provide certainly vision impairment, hearing impairment assessments, and could provide a price there. And yeah, it's certainly an option when considered in the context of someone being off work for a period of time.
Yeah, and being paid to be off work, right?
Well, quite, yeah.
James, did you want to go through the questions in the chat?
I think I've sort of done them as we've gone. If anyone has any, do you see the relationship between access to work and occupational health intertwined or completely separate? Access to work is really about providing specific adjustments. I think that occupational health assessments can throw up different things. It's worth doing both. And maybe the occupational health first, and making the access to work assessor aware of what's being discussed there. But yeah, they're slightly intertwined, I think. When applying, how much detail needs to be given? Do you just need for a basic start point, then further clarification down the line, or should you go as in-depth as possible? You have an opportunity to go into as much detail as you feel is necessary with your assessor. And so unless you want to, you don't have to provide that right at the start. They'll need to have a rough idea. Is it an ergonomic issue, a hearing impairment, whatever, so they can provide you with the assessor who can cover that. I just, this point on detail, this is something that sometimes access to work assessors kind of don't explain particularly well. The level of detail needed to do an assessment, especially about your job, but also about the barriers you're facing, can feel like it's a relatively just low level of detail, but there's a reason for that. And it's because if I'm doing an assessment for a visual impairment, for example, and someone is an accountant and they're using a computer, then I go and do another one later that day for an architect and they're using a computer, and then I work with, I don't know, a dentist in the afternoon, and they're using a computer as well for most of their job. The recommendations are going to be very, very similar, if not exactly the same. And then we would do like the edge cases for jobs that are taking us away from kind of screen time. So feel free to raise this in an assessment if you feel that the right questions aren't being asked, but don't be put off if you feel that they're not going into that much detail, because often with assessments, if it is a screen-based role, the adjustments are going to be very, very similar, irrespective of what the details of your job are.
One of the things that I've always found difficult when I've made access to work applications is that, doing it within the first 6 weeks, often you don't know that. I mean, that's one of the questions they ask you is what equipment and support do you need at the very beginning. And you're in a new job, you're in a new environment, you're with new people, and quite often I don't know the support that I need in that particular role. It may vary from the role that I was in previously. So, I mean, I've always relied on assessments to help me to understand what I need. And by the time the assessment has come along, I've been in the job a little bit longer, and my understanding of my needs is better. But I always find that a little bit of a barrier at the beginning when you make the application, where they say, well, do you know what support you need? I tend to say no.
Yeah. I mean, to that point, if you're in a new job, your employer can spec that out for you, and that can be provided to the assessor. And that can be very helpful in determining what adjustments there are. But one way to think about this, because so many jobs are now screen-based for so much of the time, think of it first in terms of how much you're using a screen for, and then thinking, when you're not using a screen, what are you doing? And that's a decent thought exercise to break the job down into the things that the assessor will need to think about. Because for that bit where you're using a screen, the software you use will just be directly related to your needs and your disability, which you'll have a better understanding of, and the assessor can then fill in the gaps. So you don't have to have this like full understanding of your job at the start. And again, if you find, once you've got the access to work report back, there are bits of your job that are not going to be present in every single job, and you've only found out about them months later, you can, and this is a real key point, you can go back to your access to work advisor, so that's the person at the DWP, and ask them to amend the report. Whether they will or not can be a bit of a mixed bag depending on who you get, but I've had a lot of success doing that, and it's a lot simpler than going through another assessment process. If they ask you to go through another assessment process, you can, I'm speaking as if to an employee now, but this is for employers supporting employees as well. The employee can challenge that and just say, look, nothing's changed in my condition. I'm just aware of this new part of my job. Here's the adjustment. And if you can provide a justification for the adjustment, in a lot of cases, they will sign it off.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Can I ask a question, Kirsty?
Yeah.
We talked about like confirming eligibility earlier. And what I wanted to know was, do you need the piece of paper that says I have a disability and this is what it is? Or are there, how do they confirm eligibility? We talked about neurodiverse colleagues on the briefing call, James, and you shared some insight there that I think would be really useful.
In terms of, so I was bringing some stuff into the chat there, just some links from we discussed. So in terms of like, how are we defining disability, and does it need to be kind of signed off in an official way?
Yeah, do you need the piece of paper that says I have a disability, this is it, and
no, not
diagnosed by?
I mean, this is really a question for an access to work advisor, but no, not in my experience. And one quite common thing would be someone who we kind of might think has dyslexia, but the screening and kind of sign-off process hasn't been gone through. The way that yeah, Lozzie is making a good point. There is a legal side to this as well. But the way that I approach this with something like dyslexia is I tend, or any kind of neurodiversity issue, is just to get a sense of the issue someone's experiencing, because it's those things that I'm recommending adjustments for. So from the point of view of an assessor, it doesn't really matter that you either have the barriers there or you don't, and that's that.
Yeah, I mean, I think often that people aren't accessing access to work because they don't have the diagnosis. So they believe they've got ADHD or dyslexia or whatever it is, but I mean, the assessment costs a bomb and they don't have the piece of paper to say, yes, it's true. So that shouldn't be a barrier.
No, not at all.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any more questions in the chat, Jim?
We've got one from Billy who's saying, can I ask a couple of questions? Which I guess is a question.
Go for it, Billy. Do you want to?
Yep, sorry, just unmuting myself there. Yeah, sorry, I've got a couple. They were storing up as you were going along, Jim. You have to excuse me. So the first one was around timeframes. So obviously on the Gov website, it says it's you can get an access to work assessment if you're either A, in work, or B, due to start work in the next 12 weeks. And they've said there's around about a 12-week turnaround time. So it kind of goes back to what Kirsty says of, if you need those reasonable adjustments on day one of your job, you mentioned you might be able to get prioritized if you know you're due to start the job. But how does that process work? I mean, are the assessors, is it sort of contracted out to private companies? Is it done by the DWP? Because obviously if somebody can't get to work on their first day, then they, it's that, yeah, just understanding that. And that kind of leads into what I asked about the portability of access to work assessments. If you're looking for a similar job, or if you're out of work, but you will need certain reasonable adjustments, what's the score there? I mean, I know the Musicians Union have done some great stuff around access riders, and we're doing some disability employment programs actually at Lewisham at the moment with Lewisham Local. So we're looking, actually they're going to do an info session that one or two of you might want to jump on next week for employers that are looking to take on people that might be have mental health, learning disabilities, or refugees. So that maybe one of you might want to, maybe I can grab you at the end. But yeah, for those that aren't in work but they're going to need that reasonable assessment, what can be done to expedite that support?
Can you just clarify your second question? So the first one is like, how does the process run, and what are the timeframes? And
yeah, and the second one is kind of around, if you're going to need that support, but you haven't had the job offer yet, but it's going to take 12 weeks to get that assessment, and you can't start the work without it. Or even you want to go into a voluntary placement. So we're doing some work with businesses to offer voluntary placements, but if they might need a reasonable adjustment, is there any support available for that as well?
So my understanding of this is that, yeah, there is this kind of absurdity about it, which is that at the moment there is a 12-week wait for support. If you apply in the first 6 weeks of the job, that is expedited. I don't know how quickly that is expedited. And I mean, a Facebook group that I spend a lot of time on with kind of visually impaired access to work clients, they're saying that there are just delays at the start of the process. It is obviously not good enough. And there are various campaigns running to try to improve that, because as you say, someone has the massive high of like getting that job and then things aren't in place for them.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a catch-22. Like, you can't start work without the assessment. You can't get the assessment unless you've had the job offer or you're in work.
Yeah.
I mean, that was why it was leading me on to the questions around, are the assessments, like I say, are they sort of third-party private companies? And yeah, what's the sort of, how much quicker is the time frame? Because we're actually doing essentially our own little mini pilot, which is akin to Kickstart, but for people with learning disabilities, where we're just going to pay for them to the employer to give them that chance at work. But you know, with something like that, whether or not we can get the funding to get the access to work done privately and get it expedited if needs be, because we've seen the problem, people aren't hiring people with disabilities. Well, we're going to pay you and show you that they're worth it, and then you can keep them on afterwards. But getting those those reasonable adjustments, it just, the whole system just seems ridiculous. Like,
it is a real weakness in the system, and it isn't good enough. On the kind of, is it quicker to do it privately? Yes, it absolutely is, and that's really dependent on who you go to and what their capacity is, and what level of service they offer. On the access to work side, so the sort of background of it, yeah, the DWP break the UK up into like a bunch of different chunks, and then they ask for people to provide assessing services for that chunk of the UK, and that will often be a private company. So you will deal with that private company for the assessment, who will then provide the thing back to the DWP. Yeah, but that's the basic idea with it. The delays, I expect, my guess is that they're dropping the funding on it, and part of this is the DWP, I think, have kicked off because other bits of the civil service were able to essentially take money out of their budget to access to work. So yeah, now, and again, to reiterate this point, because it's important, civil servants can't use access to work anymore. So private companies have just stepped in directly to do that. So yeah, no, I absolutely recognise that it's absurd, and yeah, we're sort of looking at the problem is you could maybe imagine a system where for a project like yours, right, which is that there are clear kind of social benefits to it. You could imagine like a volunteer system where assessors might give a bit of time pro bono, but the problem then is you're just not getting the funding.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from Lewisham Council, so yeah, like I said, it's part of our jobs and skills thing. We're using some European Social Fund money that we've ring-fenced for general employment, just to do our own mini pilot. Like, if the problem's there and it's not being addressed, just don't talk about it, go out and fix it. Basically, that's the approach that's being taken. Those that are sort of further won't get those opportunities. I mean, I mentioned access riders that the Musicians Union have put together. I don't know if you've come across them. Essentially, it just sets out what your needs would be for a particular venue. But is it worth somebody looking at that to approach an employer with that prior to getting their access to work, saying these are some of the adjustments that are, pretty much guaranteed to be needed? Because that's something we were talking about for the learning disability sort of voluntary work placement because obviously you're not going to get access to work for voluntary for a 2-week, 4-week placement, but putting together that alongside the person that's going to be going into work and saying, so trying to demystify it for the employer. So if they're visually impaired, saying this is what they would need, or if they've got physical mobility issues, just stating out and saying straight off the bat, this is what they're going to need. So not trying to have that awkward conversation on day one and then go, oh, you can't do your job, go home for 2 months. I don't know if you've come across that thing from I'll link it in if you haven't. But
this takes us on to what would be called in a more general sense like adjustment passporting. So it's a document that sets out what adjustments are needed. And once that's in place, then you don't have to kind of explain anything. It's just you go to an employer and that's that. You go to a different job with the same employer, your line manager changes, all of these variables that can really throw the process off. That passport is a document that is the starting point of kind of like institutional knowledge about this stuff, right? You go to a different employer, you've got that document there. Now, what I always say when I'm doing assessments is when someone has that final report, if your employer doesn't have an official kind of passporting system, that report will just will do the job. But yeah, no, the idea that having it written down and kind of codified is sensible is yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it's something we used when I was a care worker in my previous role. I was a communication passports for non-verbal, but yeah, the access passport, I've not come across that, but it sounds pretty much identical to the access rider. But yeah, no, that's really good. That's really good to know. Thank you.
So we've got just a few minutes left. Does anybody else have any questions? You could probably squeeze in a couple of quick ones if anybody's got any questions they want to raise. Anything in the chat, Jim, that we haven't picked up?
Can you request an assessor who knows about neurodivergent conditions? Thanks, Lozzie. Yeah, I mean, any assessor that is provided for you should have an understanding of whatever your needs, conditions, disability is. And if you would like to make that request kind of explicit at the start, sure, I don't think that's gonna be a problem. There are some, and again, do not be put off by this, these are the sort of worst cases where the wrong assessor is just allocated to the job. But in cases like that, there is a process you can go through just to have another assessment. Does that answer the question, Lozzie?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Cool. A sort of administrative thing from Billy for Em and Kirsty, I think.
Yeah, we can catch up, Billy.
Okay. All right. Well, I just want to say a huge thanks to Jim for coming along and sharing his knowledge with us today. It's a huge topic to cover, and we do hope that it has been helpful. So thanks ever so much, Jim, for coming along today and giving us lots of really useful information, and I understand you've put lots more useful information in the chat. So Em, thank you to you for coming along and helping to facilitate and sharing your background as well, and thank you to all our guests who joined us this afternoon. We do hope you found it useful. Just to say, we have 2 more sessions coming up over the next 2 weeks. So next week, you will have the opportunity to ask questions of disabled people themselves. So we've got a panel of disabled people who are ready, willing to answer any questions about their personal experiences. They're really excited about that one. Same time next week, we'll pop out the link shortly, and please do register for that. And all that's left for me to say is have a wonderful, wonderful Friday afternoon and weekend ahead. We're nearly there, folks. Woohoo! And take care in the heat. So thank you, everybody. And see you again soon.
Thanks, Kirsty. Thanks, everyone. Bye.